Welcome back to Decode Healthcare. I'm Herschel. Today, we're tackling something that trips up so many coders, the Integumentary System CPT guidelines. I know, it looks like a giant wall of text and numbers, right? But our goal today is to translate all of that into clear, visual logic. Because the CPT rulebook isn't just some random list. It actually tells the exact story of a surgery from start to finish. Let's dive right in.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to hit skin basics, biopsies and needles, removing lesions, wound repair rules, and finally, skin grafts and flaps.
Section 1, Skin Basics, Understanding Anatomy.
Okay, before we can even think about assigning a code, we absolutely have to know the anatomy. This visually breaks down the battlefield of dermatological surgery. You've got the epidermis on top, the dermis right in the middle, and the subcutaneous tissue down below. This is super crucial because your procedure codes will completely change depending on whether a tool stops at the surface or goes deep into that subcutaneous layer. You literally have to know your layers to know your codes.
Moving on to Section 2, Biopsies and Fine Needles.
So let's start the patient's journey with diagnostics. When a doctor takes a tissue sample, the CPT guidelines are actually incredibly strict. They explicitly divide biopsies into 3 very distinct techniques. It's not just about taking a piece of skin, it's all about the physician's intent and the specific tools they're using. First, we have the tangential biopsy, which is basically a shallow shave or scoop. Then there's the punch biopsy. That's your full-thickness cylindrical sample. And finally, the incisional biopsy, where a sharp blade goes deep into the subcutaneous space.
Let's zoom in on that tangential biopsy for a second. Doctors usually do this with a flexible blade or scalpel. The defining feature here is that it usually only removes epidermal tissue. It might take tiny bits of the underlying dermis, but overall, it's just a partial thickness sample. Notice how the blade is really just skimming the surface here? It's not digging a deep hole at all.
But what happens when a doctor needs to biopsy multiple spots and they use different techniques on the exact same day? Well, the CPT rulebook gives us a really clear hierarchy to follow. The absolute rule is this: you always list the most complex technique as your primary code. Then you use specific add-on codes for the rest. So if a doctor does one deep incisional biopsy and one shallow tangential biopsy, that incisional code takes the primary spot, hands down. The tangential just becomes an add-on. It's all about respecting that hierarchy of surgical complexity.
All right, Section 3, Removing Skin Lesions.
Let's say that biopsy comes back and the doctor says, okay, the entire lesion needs to go. Now, the term excision gets thrown around a lot, but in CPT world, it has a very rigid definition. An excision means the full thickness removal of a lesion. The critical rule you have to remember is that a true excision must go completely through the dermis. If it doesn't pass through the dermis, you aren't coding an excision. You might just have a shave removal on your hands. Oh, and by the way, this code naturally includes a simple, non-layered closure of the wound, so you don't code that separately. Here is where coding literally turns into math. You do not pick your code based on the size of the lesion alone. Your final measurement is the maximum clinical diameter of the lesion itself, plus the narrowest margins required to remove it. You have to add the healthy tissue they took on the sides to the size of the actual defect. That total X-size diameter is what dictates your code. This visual perfectly anchors that definition we were just talking about. Just look at the depth of the scalpel there. It's removing the entire lesion block, slicing all the way down through the dermis and right into that subcutaneous layer we identified earlier. That right there is exactly what a true full-thickness excision looks like in real life.
Section 4, Rules of Wound Repair, Closing the Defect. So the lesion is gone, and the surgeon is left with a hole they need to close up. A massive coding pitfall here is mixing up closure complexities. The rules basically categorize repairs into 3 distinct buckets. Simple repair is just closing the epidermis and dermis. Think of your straightforward, superficial stitches. Intermediate repair steps it up a notch. It requires layered closures of deeper tissue, like the superficial fascia. And finally, complex repair involves extensive modifications, like major tissue rearrangement or undermining, before the wound can even be stitched up.
Now, the rules get highly specific when a patient has multiple wounds. First, you have to measure every single wound in centimeters. Then, you group together repairs that share the exact same classification, say all intermediate repairs, and the exact same anatomic zone, like the trunk and extremities. Once they're grouped, you add those links together to get one single code. But listen up, because here is the golden rule. Never, ever combine the length of a simple repair with a complex one. They absolutely must stay in their own separate lanes.
If you're wondering what actually elevates a repair to that complex category, this is it.
This shows extensive undermining. It's a surgical prep where the doctor literally separates the skin from the underlying tissue over a really wide area, just to stretch it over a defect. Because this takes significantly more surgical work and skill, doing this automatically bumps a repair code into the complex category, no matter how big or small the wound is.
And finally, Section 5, Skin Grafts and Flaps.
So what happens when a defect is just way too large, or maybe too awkwardly placed for standard suturing? When you can't just pull the edges together, you actually have to move tissue around. The CPT book groups these as adjacent tissue transfers, or rearrangements. We're talking about procedures with names like Z-plasty, W-plasty, rotation flaps, and advancement flaps. These go way beyond direct closure. They involve cutting and rerouting healthy adjacent skin so it swings over to cover the primary surgical defect.
Let's look at the actual mechanics of this. We have an advancement flap on top and a rotation flap on the bottom. Pay close attention to the math required here. Coat selection for these transfers is not just based on the size of the original hole. It's actually based on the combined total square centimeters of both the primary defect being covered and the secondary defect the surgeon creates by cutting and moving that flap of skin in the first place. You are coding for the entire modified area.
For highly complex reconstructive procedures, like the mid-phase flap you see here, the guidelines become intensely focused on anatomy. These codes are categorized not just by their size, but by the specific preservation of blood supply, those are the vascular pedicles, and the exact anatomic region receiving the graft. I mean, the surgeon is literally rearranging the architecture of the face while keeping all the blood vessels intact. It's pretty amazing.
So, I'll leave you with this thought. If medical coding truly tells the story of a surgery, are you reading the anatomy, or are you just hunting for numbers on a page? By tying these numeric rules directly back to the physical anatomy and the surgeon's real intent, things like depth, margins, and tissue rearrangement, the CPT book stops being this confusing giant list of digits. It actually turns into a fascinating map of the human body. And understanding that map is the true secret to mastering the codes. Thanks so much for joining me on Decode Healthcare, and keep exploring.